thinking about water this morning. Water. And for some reason, I'm thinking about something that I did some time ago that I couldn't have done. So I'll confess it to you now. It was many years ago, actually. You know, our Baptist friends love water. Have you ever, you know that they can't do a baptism without going all the way under the water.
Amen.
That's the way to go. Yeah, that's just the only way to go. Well, I was having lunch with one of my colleagues, a Baptist minister, who was kind of full of himself, as ministers sometimes are. And I enjoyed sort of poking little things at him and just seeing what his reaction would be. And one day it occurred to me to say to him, you know, Harold, I don't think you guys have it right at all about this immersion, this dunking. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, think about it. In the Bible, God never wants people to get wet. I mean, where does God choose the Holy Land to be? In one of the most arid, desert places in the world, Israel. No wetness there, except for that little tiny ribbon of water called the Jordan River that flows into the Dead Sea. And then I said, think about it when they came out of Egypt and how they had to cross the sea. God didn't let them get wet. Parted the waters, walked over on dry ground. Think about that. And how it was always that it seemed that God preserved people from the water. Jesus comes out walking on the water, not in the water, swimming, and saves poor old Peter's scrawny neck when he just about drowns. So I was just digging at the guy, and I don't know if he ever forgave me for that. And that has nothing whatsoever to do with what we're about today, but I just thought I'd share the story and confess my sin. Now, there is in the scripture, and you can just thumb through it, numerous places where God says, as a sign of his redemptiveness, I'm going to give you some water. Because we've got to have it. You can't live without water. We all know that. So our text today, from two places in Isaiah, when the poor and needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst, I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers on bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. I will put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I will set in the desert the cypress, the plane, and the pine together, so that all may see and know, and all may consider and understand, that the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. And then this other text, I'm about to do a new thing, and now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. The wild animals will honor me, the jackals and the ostriches. For I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people whom I formed for myself, so that they might declare my praise. This is God's holy word. All of creation speaks God's holy word. The scriptures define that and refine it for us and place God's truth in our minds for our pondering and our meditation. Thanks be to God. And may these words find resonance with our spirits. Amen. So as many of you know, Suzanne and I have just ended a 3-week odyssey out west, and it was a delightful time. I turned 70 in April of this year. I know that's hard for you to believe, but I did 70 on the second day of April. And Suzanne said to me, what would you like to do for your 70th year of life? And I said, well, I'd like to travel. Not overseas, but just drive. And so this started a conversation. Originally, we were going to drive across Canada on the Trans-Canadian Highway because my father was a Canadian and I wanted to sort of touch in with the roots of his life. But that didn't prove feasible or practical because of time and expense and all that. So we began to massage this idea until we created this trip, 3 weeks out west looking at the national parks. And we have a glorious country, and we have beautiful land. And I know that many of you have traveled to places like the Grand Canyon and Zion National Park and Canyonlands and Arches and all of those magical places. I had never been to any of them. And so it was all new. We flew out to Sacramento, Suzanne did a conference, and then we got a car and we started driving. And for 2,000 plus miles, we drove in the American West, in California, in Nevada, in Utah, and saw a marvelous, marvelous country. Now that country out there is high desert, and it is dry country to a large extent. And you go from a mountain pass and come down into a long valley, and the land is arid and it looks brittle because there is no water. And then you go back up into a mountain pass, and there the land looks brittle because there is no water on the tops of mountains. And I began to think to myself as we drove along, how in the world do people survive out here? How does wildlife make it? How do you live in this arid environment? And then my eye began to catch glimpses of salvation, literally. Because off in the distance there would be a line of green, some trees, some flowers, and I knew that's where the water was. A little creek was going through there. Somewhere in that arid land, a little bit of water was supplying life. And it became a metaphor for me to think about and contemplate as we drove along. While we were on our trip, Las Vegas happened, that tragedy. In fact, thanks be to Aubrey Hickman, he called us the morning of that tragedy to make sure we were not in Las Vegas, and I appreciated his concern. We were actually in a tent in Yosemite when he called, but it was good to know that he was thinking of us. The tragedy of Las Vegas, the tragedy of the shootings in Baton Rouge, the tragedy of violence that each of us is shocked by every morning when we open our newspapers or turn on the news. It is as though we're living in an arid and desert land to a large degree. And you wonder, where in the world will the water of healing come from? It comes from you, and it comes from me. It comes from the acts of compassion that we do, that where our deep joy begins to resonate with the world's deep need, and we put that into effect, that's where the watering of life happens. It happens in something as simple and as complex and as beautiful as that thing we call compassion. Compassion. Now, if you want to dabble in the mystical, if you want to go deep into the spirit, you need go no further than that pot that's marked compassion. Now, the word, you probably know, comes from the Latin, literally means to be with suffering, compassio, and that's it, to just be with suffering. Compassion is not something that offers answers to people's problems. It gives no reason. It has no rational justification. It's not a counselor. It's not a doctor. It's not mother's milk. It's not father's wisdom. It just is. Compassion is not a commodity that can be bought or borrowed or sold or traded. You can't lay your money down at the altars of self-help workshops and therapist workshops and social workers' desks and minister's office and doctor's tables and psychics' living rooms and gurus' caves and expect compassion to spontaneously geyser itself into your life. Compassion with a price tag isn't compassion at all. And yet compassion is what I'm convinced waters life and gives life the life-giving spirit that it has to have. You can't hoard compassion. You can't save compassion. You can't invest compassion. You can't stick it under your mattress. You can't stuff it in the freezer and pull it out when you need it. Like most of the really worthwhile happenings in your life, compassion is a catch-it-while-you-can kind of critter. It doesn't lounge around in corners waiting for crises to appear. It doesn't lurk in the shadows waiting for you to stumble or to screw up. It doesn't hold up in a fort waiting to ride out on a white horse to save your scrawny neck. No. In truth, compassion is really one of the most ludicrous ideas that has ever been hatched from the human divine consciousness egg. To be with suffering. To be with suffering. To hunker down. To cuddle up. To snuggle up the pain. To actually get close enough to another's pain so that you feel it as your own. To share it. To touch it, to taste it, to smell it. It is an absurd and preposterous and more than a little repugnant idea to think that anyone in their right mind would voluntarily get close enough to another's muck and misery to actually experience it. I mean, isn't there enough pain and suffering to go around already? Don't each of us have enough stuff of our own to deal with? Why in the world would we ever want to share someone else's anguish or wretchedness? It makes no sense whatsoever, and yet we do it. Oh, yes, we do. And here comes the mystery. Because somehow, in this insane act of caring in a way that lets another's hurt become our hurt. We experience one of the most life-restoring and regenerative of all human encounters. Compassion is no cure, it's no antidote to pain or suffering, but compassion takes you into a deeper wisdom, to a higher awareness, to eternity. Compassion is spirituality beyond religion. It is not bound by doctrine or dogma or creed or tradition. Compassion is free to make love with your heart and with your soul. And as we drove across that arid west of our beautiful land, and I saw those places of green here and there, I thought about how we can water the souls of one another and wet this world with the moistness of love. And out of that, I have to believe there is a greenness that comes. There is a refreshing that the world is in such desperate need of. It doesn't take a genius to be a compassionate person, does it? Every one of us has probably been the recipient of somebody else's beautiful expression of compassion in our lives. I remember when our daughter was born, 45 years ago. I was living at the time in London, and labor began early one morning. We went to the London hospital, didn't know a soul, and something wasn't going right. And the doctors kept saying to me, would you mind leaving the room for a moment? Would you mind leaving? And then I'd get to go back in, and then they'd kick me out. And that went on until finally I didn't want to go back in. I was scared to death. 26 years old, about to become a father, and scared wordless. Well, I sat there in the hall of that big hospital, in that foreign land, and hung my head and said my prayers. And a lady pushing one of those carts that you see domestic help do in hotels and institutions came along with a bucket and her mop, and she had on those heavy-duty stockings that you never see anymore, that you tie off at the knee. I'll never forget her. And she said in a Cockney accent, as she pushed her bucket past me, her cart, she said, "Love, you look as though you could use a cup of tea." I'm not a tea drinker, but I said that would be nice. And she got a cup of tea. And she came with two, one for her and one for me, and sat down. And for the better part of an hour, just sat there and talked about this and that, and shared the story of her life, and asked me to share the story of my life. It made the time bearable, and then the announcement of the birth, and that all was well. She was not a well-educated woman, but I tell you, she had a PhD that day, as far as I'm concerned, in this mystery called compassion. We can all do that for one another. And when we do, we create those oases of green for life to flourish and to come alive in. Listen to this true story. Woman reports that it had been one of those days. She was hurrying to pack to catch a plane. And her son was telling her, while she was hurrying to pack, in boring detail, as only young kids can do, about a movie they had seen the night before, punctuated with 3,000 you knows. You know how aggravating that can be? You know. 3 different people called her as she was walking out of the door. The taxi driver was late and was very obnoxious. Finally, she checked her baggage at the counter at the airport. She confirmed her ticket. She sat down in the waiting area of the airport to hear her flight called. And then it happened. One more interruption. And this is how she describes it. She said there were 30 whole beautiful minutes before my plane was to take off. Time for me to catch my breath, to be alone with my own thoughts, to begin reading my book. And a voice next to me, belonging to an elderly woman, said, "I bet it's cold in Chicago." Stone-faced, I replied, "Probably so." "I haven't been to Chicago in nearly 3 years," she said. "My son lives there." "That's nice," I said, my eyes intent on my book. "My husband's body is on this plane," she said. "We've been married for 53 years. And the woman telling the story said, "I don't think I have ever detested myself more than I did at that moment. Another human being was screaming to be heard, and in desperation had turned to a cold stranger who was more interested in a novel than in the real-life drama at her elbow. She needed no advice, no money, no assistance, no expertise. All she needed was someone who would listen and perhaps share and show a little compassion." The old lady talked numbly, the lady said, and steadily, until we boarded the plane. And then she found her seat in another section. And as I put my coat in the overhead bin, I heard her say to her seat companion, "I bet it's cold in Chicago." And I prayed, oh God, please let him listen. We live in a dry and arid world. You don't need me to tell you that. We don't need to recount all the blemishes that are out there on the landscape. We know them well enough. We have seen them, we've experienced them, we've felt them. What we need, though, is to be reminded of, in the words of Jude's song at the beginning of the service, of the light that we can be, of the watering of compassion that we can bring to the pain and to the hurt of life. And so if you don't do anything else with your day this day, if you don't do anything else with this service today, let it be a moment where we resolve, oh Lord, in the moments that I have the opportunity to do, I will be a little more gentle, a little more attentive, a little less hurried, a little more present. I will be your expression of compassion in someone's life. And if we do that, you can bet that rivers will flow in the desert, as Isaiah shouted out, and water will flow abundantly, and life will be nourished, and we will be part of the expression of that light and that love that makes such a difference in the kind of world that we live in. I may not know much after 70 years of living, but I am convinced that in the end, it is love that sees us through, and it is love that saves the day. And in the words of the great Dr. Martin Luther King, I pray that we as a church will say to love, I take you as my beloved spouse, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer. In sickness and in health, I win myself to love. For to do so is to be a spring of water in a dry and arid environment that so needs that life-giving nourishment. Compassion. That's what I thought about as we drove along on those miles and miles of roads out in the big American West. Compassion. Greening, flowers. What a beautiful sight. What a deep blessing. What a great joy to behold. And we can do that. Yes, we can. Each and every one of us. Amen. Amen. And so, we will sing. This is not worthy of that. We'll get up and stumble through. The hymn is what I just said. Love is the answer. You'll find it in an insert in your bulletin. Let's stand. Let's sing together. Mary and Jude lead us.